This is Dan Schneider, and on this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject will be filmmaker Michelangelo Antonioni. I have three experts on his life and career. They are Hamish Ford, Mike Grost, and Richard Pena, and we will begin in a moment. All right, in this segment, I would like to introduce the three men that you see on your screen, and then talk a little bit about who Michelangelo Antonioni was for anyone who may be watching this and never have heard of the man. Let me start from left to right. You'll see a photo of Hamish Ford. He's joining us from Australia, and if I could ask Hamish to talk a little bit about himself, his interest in film, cinema in general, and specifically what may have drawn him to write about Antonioni, and if he has any websites or anything, he can plug it here.
Yeah, hi. I teach film studies at the University of Newcastle in Australia, and I'm a specialist in post-war European cinema, particularly the kind of filmmaking that now we often refer to as modernist or modern cinema. And I mean that in the sense of feature films, not avant-garde films in that tradition, but feature films that are involved in a radical kind of remaking of the whole notion of narrative cinema. So the work of Michelangelo Antonioni is obviously very central to that story. And in fact, my initial encounter with his work was as, I think, a teenager. I was leafing through a book, a wonderful book by Luis Giannetti called Understanding Movies. And they had stills from L'Avventura. And I was reading about the initial scandal of that film at Cannes in May 1960. And the way in which the film was canonized very, very quickly within a couple of years, so that in 1962 it was voted second best film ever made after Orson Welles' Citizen Kane. And it just, it set in my mind a real kind of fascination with this moment in audiovisual culture and history. It wasn't quite a few years though until I finally got to see his work in its proper form, because as all of us know, and I'm sure many of the listeners, Antonioni's work is an absolute debacle if you try and watch it on old pan and scan VHS, or even badly preserved 16mm prints, which were, certainly the common way to access a lot of art house cinema in the 1980s and early 90s. So when I finally encountered his work in its fullest flower, interestingly, it was a screening of L'Avventura that I organised for the University Film Society that I was running at the time. This is in the early 90s. And 10 people showed up, and half of us thought it was literally, one of the most staggeringly different and beautiful and mysterious films we'd ever seen. And the other half of the audience were disgusted and felt that that was 2.5 hours of their lives they'd never get back. And it's fascinating to me that, 30-odd years, 35 years almost since that initial Cannes outrage and kind of controversy, the film was still able to do that. So subsequently to that initial kind of encounter with Antonioni's work, I've gone on to write a fair bit about it, I guess. Fairly theoretical articles, like, for example, an article on L'Avventura in the journal Census of Cinema that looks at the film and its relationship to Gilles Deleuze's, the French post-structuralist philosopher's notion of the time image and modern cinema as being defined around this. And more recently, I've written a very lengthy article, again for the same publication actually, Census of Cinema, on the so-called Tetralogy, the 4 films that I think is still the most important, which is L'Avventura, La Notte, L'Eclisse, and Il Disotoroso, the early 60s features. And finally, just in 2012, I released a book called Post-War Modernist Cinema and Philosophy, Confronting Negativity in Time, which features an extensive analysis of L'Eclisse, which, like many people, I consider Antonioni's masterpiece. Thanks.
Well, let me just ask before I move on to Mike Grost. I'm in America, and I grew up, I was born in '65, so I grew up in the early '70s. And I did actually a show on film criticism a few weeks ago talking about the film culture of America back then, when movies would run here for 1.5 to 2.5 years sometimes. And I remember foreign films where I was growing up were either like Swedish pornos, or they were the Paul Naschy type Spanish films. What was foreign film like in Australia? Were you guys more more educated than us slobbering Americans, or was there a more thriving intellectual film culture down under?
Well, look, it's a good question. Certainly, things like the Sydney Film Festival, which started in the 1960s, were very important ways in which people in this country and the Melbourne Film Festival soon after as well could start to access global cutting edge cinema. But my own personal experience is very much actually involved with television, and that is a then completely globally unique phenomenon, which was the advent of a public station called SBS, which was called the Special Broadcasting Service. And its remit was to screen global culture in general, and in particular with a focus on movies. And through much of SBS's life, sadly this is no longer the case to a large degree, but for much of its life it screened on average about 70 non-English language films a week, which is quite staggering when you think about it. And my initial encounter with post-war European cinema, but also much else beyond Iranian cinema and the Japanese classics and so forth, was actually by watching this network, which in addition to screening these films, introduced them sometimes, giving you historical context by a couple of or a handful of critics, and most importantly in some ways, or very importantly, screening them in the correct aspect ratio, which of course, as many of us know, was the bane of the VHS era. And finally, I guess I should add that SBS specially subtitled a whole bunch of films which to this day have not actually had any other commercial English language friendly release. So I'd say that actually makes Australian film culture in some ways a slightly different story, I guess you could say. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Hamish. The next person in the middle is Mike Gross. We don't have any video, but we have him on audio. And Mike, I found looking online for Antonioni essays, and he has a website called mikegrost.com. So, Mike, I would take it that you're our of the three panelists, you're our non-academic. Are you just a film fan? Tell us about your website and who you are and your interest in Antonioni.
Yes, I'm not an academic. Currently, I have a website. It's a tourist. It has articles on around 120 different directors. There's a 60-page article on Antonioni, who's a great director, and I'm a retired computer scientist. I have a PhD in mathematics from University of Michigan. I'm a full-time writer. I write mystery short stories, a long, large-scale history of prose mystery fiction, the film website, which has mainly director articles on it, as I've said, and another website, which is a large history of Golden Age and Silver Age American comic books.
Go ahead, Mike. Continue.
Okay. Here, I'm very interested in visual style in directors and have tried to write as much about visual style as possible. Antonioni's got a wonderful, magnificent, original and personal visual style. So you could spend the rest of your life just trying to analyze what is going on in his work. Oftentimes I've tried to use some simple mathematics and geometry in analyzing directors' visual styles. And a highlight of my Antonioni articles and analysis of La Notte in its visual style, especially in the first half, which has all the wonderful geometric patterns of buildings, windows, in trying to pick up on the use of rectangles, trapezoids, and various zones of geometric patterns in the film. So I'm also very interested in circular forms used by Antonioni, which occur in his cinema from the earliest days of his documentaries to his last. And this is part of an extensive interest in visual style in other directors too. Some of the articles on the website are very short. Others are book length. There's book length studies of Fritz Lang, Alan Dwan, Joseph H. Lewis, Vincent Minnelli, the Tourneurs, father and son, that Jacques and Maurice Tourneur, and Raoul Walsh. and long articles on a number of other directors, especially Louis Fayard, Anya Sparta, Edgar G. Ulmer. Those are all favorites here.
Oh, good. Well, when I do for like a lot of the B directors, Ulmer and Tourneur, I'll be sure to contact you again. Let me just ask you about the one thing about Antonioni. When did you first see Antonioni films? Was it the 70s or 80s? And how old were you at the time?
I was born in 1953, and I discovered classic films late in 1969 when I was 16 years old. A screening of Potemkin at College Film Society was a great, overwhelming experience for me, followed up by Lillian Gish arriving at the Film Society in person to show Way Down East. So I first saw Antonioni films at a commercial theater. In the early 70s, they had a double bill of Zabriskie Point and Blow Up, and that's got to be the daily double of all time in terms of great filmmaking. It was just wonderful. I'd already seen films by Rossellini, who wasn't as a great favorite of mine. I soon got to see at a local community college a 16 millimeter print of La Ventura, which is, as we just learned, was pan and scan, but it was still a great experience. And I agree that I think all film scholars today agree that film should always be seen in their correct aspect ratio. So I'm hardly defending the practice, but I did come up in an era where oftentimes you'd see stuff in horribly inauthentic forms, pan and scan on television. For a long time, I had analysis of Jordan Belson's Allures on my website, which said the movie consisted of black and white patterns. And correspondent kindly wrote to me that I was completely wrong. The film was in color. And I eventually managed to get a DVD of it, and lo and behold, it was color. I'd seen it broadcast in black and white on television. So there were a lot of the 60s and 70s can be overrated as a time of cinephilia, because we did in fact see a lot of films under wrong aspect ratios, poor broadcasting in black and white instead of color, all sorts of technical glitches that hopefully no one would tolerate for a minute today.
Okay, thank you, Mike. The third panelist over on the right there is Richard Pena, and he's a film professor at Columbia University. So, Richard, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what drew you to the works of Antonioni.
Okay, but first I want to correct what I think is your really completely inaccurate version of U.S. film culture in the 1960s. In 1965, 10% of all movie tickets sold in America were sold for foreign language subtitled films. About 1% is sold nowadays. This was a time when the New York Film Festival was founded in 1963 at Lincoln Center, the mecca of the arts in the United States, showing a real perception for how important film was. We also had critics writing like Andrew Saris, Paul Kale, Penelope Gilliott, Manny Farber, Archer Winston. So I don't really think the 60s have anything to do with this image of slobbering Swedish films and whatever. It's really very inaccurate. I first discovered Antonioni with Blow Up, 1967 or 78, I think it was. I saw it. I was just about a freshman in high school back then. And I was really impressed by the film. I had heard about Antonioni, but not seen any of his work. And thought it was really an amazing film. And I remember I went to it several times with friends. That summer back in New York, I went to high school in the Boston area. I got to see, I think it was La Ventura and Eclipse. I didn't see the note until later. And then after that, there was Zabriskie Point, which came out, which baffled me. It still kind of baffles me, but I was already pretty much an Antonioni fan. I'm flattered to be called an Antonioni expert. I'm really not. I love his work very, very much, but I can't say I've done that much special work on him. I'm really a Latin Americanist, and I also do a lot of work on Chinese cinema. But Antonioni is somebody who I just loved, and in a sense, in a certain way, my work is probably closer in terms of my relation to Antonioni in terms of my history as a film programmer. When we began the Walter Reed Theater at Lincoln Center, where I worked for 25 years, one of our first major retrospectives was a absolutely complete Antonioni retrospective. And we were able to bring him, which was 1992. and I got to spend about 4 days with him. And even though he couldn't speak very well, he could still make himself understood, and it was really such an honor and privilege to get to know him. And I got to see him a few times after that as well. And he himself would often say that that retrospective in New York really helped relaunch his career. He had sort of, in a certain way, faded, certainly in the United States, from a lot of people's consideration. After that, it was repeated in many places around the U.S., so I was very proud of that. I also did the commentary for the Criterion version of Eclipse, and I agree very much with Hamish that it is, I think, Antonioni's greatest masterpiece. He made several. So in that way, I had the privilege of being able to do that. I've also taught a seminar on Eclipse. So I guess that's merely my connection to him. As I said, I hardly consider myself an expert, although an absolutely passionate fan who feels that he's beyond doubt one of the greatest figures to have ever worked in the cinema.
All right, thank you, Richard. So let's step backwards a little bit, because I never like to assume that people watching a show are going to know everything about it. So there are going to be people who might be encountering the name for the first time. So maybe Hamish or Michael, if they are a little bit more in depth about his past. I know Antonioni was born in 1912. He would have, I guess, reached manhood during the rise of the fascist party. Let's talk about his first 20 or 30 years before he started making films. What kind of a person was he? What is his background? Was he sympathetic to the fascists, or what? Anyone?
Do you want to go ahead?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Hi. Look, he's an interesting figure in that. Well, actually, just before I launch into that, I'd just like to echo something that Richard just said. In regards to Antonioni's kind of legacy, or I think Richard maybe accidentally made it. A friend of mine has been living in China for many years and doing a lot of work on the documentary cinema movement over there, the largely underground documentary cinema movement. And he's done a lot of interviews with different kinds of filmmakers and critics. And time again, Antonioni is the name from the European canon, as we would see it, that gets the most frequently mentioned by filmmakers and critics over there. And it's in part perhaps because of his notorious, and we'll talk about it later, I'm sure, but marvelous documentary that he made in China in the early 70s. But it's not just that. The connection between his work and Hou Hsiao and Simon Liang and many other great Chinese language directors of the last 20 or 30 years is very, very strong. Even where those directors weren't explicitly influenced by Antonioni in the beginning, there's a kind of very, very interesting relationship there. So I think the global relevance of his work continues to become apparent. Going back to the beginning, though, he was born and raised in Ferrara, which is a beautiful, relatively small but quite powerful regional centre in the Po Valley area, or the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy in the north. He went to university in Bologna, which is a beautiful university town and hosts the marvellous yearly festival that specialises in restored films every year. He was virtually a tennis professional at one point, and went to university, as I say, in Bologna. He was basically a good middle-class northern Italian son. His relationship to politics that you asked about is constantly debated in Italy. Like most of his generation, who ended up working as a critic under Mussolini's son, in fact, who was the editor of the main kind of cinema journal, and in some ways kind of funding body during the late fascist period, the pre-war period this is. It was assumed, we may assume that those guys had some kind of loose political affiliation with fascism. In fact, what Mussolini's son discovered very quickly is that most of them were left-wingers of one kind or another. And to the extent that we can discuss Antonioni's explicit politics, he would appear to be some kind of left-winger. Certainly he was a secularist and an atheist, which was very important, and he's still very important in Italy. And his his films, I think, as Richard, I think, points out actually on his commentary that I was just flicking through earlier for Le Cliché, he is, I think, in a subtle way, a very political filmmaker. And the more, I think, work that is done on his films, including the early films, the more apparent that is, the more he's a very sensitive kind of filter of the political tensions in Italy during an extraordinary period of transformation from the fascist period through a lot of post-war poverty to the so-called miracle, the economic miracle of the late 50s, and into the kind of uber capitalism in the later decades. So he's an interesting figure when it comes to politics, certainly. In Italian film criticism, his work has been debated, particularly because a lot of the dominant film critics, when his most famous films are released, were loosely or explicitly Marxist in orientation. And they were certainly fascinated by, but also troubled by, Antonioni's work for all of the, I guess, the predictable reasons, but most obviously because of his concentration in the most famous films on a very privileged class. I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, Mike Gross, do you have any comment on the early life of Antonioni?
No, and I know very little about Antonioni as a person. I've just watched his films. So sorry, I don't.
Okay, Richard, do you have any comment?
Yeah, just to sort of echo what Hamish was saying, in fact, it's one of the kind of anomalies of this sort of fascist period that one area that really was a kind of somewhat safe haven for people of a certain left wing or liberal persuasion was film. And in fact, there were a lot of incredibly progressive thinkers who were writing about film at that time. For example, the first translation into, say, a Western European language of the writing of Dziga Vertov, the great Soviet director, were done in Italy. And at the Centro Sperimentale, they looked at Soviet films all the time. So there was a really curious sort of relationship between those two cultures. I think it also affected Antonioni. Antonioni is very famous for a statement, maybe it applies more to what we'll speak about later, for saying that he took the bicycle out of neorealism. And in a way, I think that that's a kind of very interesting way to think of him. There's a recent exhibition in Paris, a very interesting one about Antonioni and contemporary art. But one of the claims the curator made was that he kind of broke with neorealism. And I think that's too harsh. I don't think he really did. I think he represents one of the many interesting evolutions of that style that went on in the 1950s. And you can certainly see a number of his works, including the Tetralogy, is, I think, founded in a certain way on principles that began in the 1940s, but by the time he got to really use them, had really reached another place.
I wanted to talk a little bit about his documentaries, and let's talk that before we get into the feature films. I know I've asked before some other film critics about the Axis powers and their film cultures, and how Japan and Italy flourished after the war, while Germany basically floundered for a good quarter century before the Werner Herzogs and that generation came along. And I know people have told me that they think that because Germany was the last well, it wasn't the last, Japan actually was, but I forget there was a reason someone had said that I guess Germany was maybe more unrepentant. Why do you think that Italian film culture flourished after the war the way Japanese cinema did, whereas German cinema didn't? And do you think that it had to do with maybe during the war that Italy and Japan did have flourishing film cultures, whereas Germany may not have? I don't know. I'm asking. Anyone want to?
Well, first of all, I think it's a little unfair to say that about Germany. I mean, Germany was making over 100 films a year in the 1950s, and the films were seen widely in Germany and were exported to other German-speaking countries. What Germany really lacked, I think, during that period was what you might think of as a major auteur. Yeah. You have Wolfgang Stauter, you have a couple of other people, I think, of similar rank. Per Thielmans and whatever, but in a certain way they weren't of a kind of auteurist stature. But in fact, I think it's a period of cinema in which there was a lot of interesting film made, and the industry ran quite well. Where the industry began to flounder was in the early 60s, when a lot of the other stars and directors began to die, and they were sort of searching for a formula, up against which was this very new cinema coming out of France and Italy and other places. And it took the Germans a little while to respond to that. But actually, German film did reasonably well. In the case of both Japan and Italy, the really larger issue is export. Both of them became big export industries, and that's what really distinguished them. And Italy became an export industry through neorealism, and in fact, it happened in New York. Open City, by Rossellini, had been released in Italy to mixed to fair reviews. It had opened in Paris to very good reviews, but not much business, and it came to New York and was a huge hit. And once that happened, it really began a whole kind of wave of foreign film going and export of Italian film to the U.S. and to other places. That's what really helped to create the industry, in a sense, that they had that export capacity. Jump 5 years, and you have a similar phenomenon happening in Japan with Rashomon. Rashomon becomes this worldwide sensation, and suddenly a cinema that didn't export anywhere is being exported all over the planet. So in both cases, you could say they were lucky to have export opportunities. That never happened with Germany for various reasons. One could say maybe they didn't make a good enough film or whatever, but indeed, it was really the export opportunities of both their industries that laid the groundwork for them to really expand beyond what had been their pre-war capacity.
Yeah, and I think the person who had told me said that Germany basically expelled most of its artists, whereas Italy and Japan, like Fritz Lang, left for the U.S. and they went to Hollywood, whereas Japan and Italy basically kept on their people. So, Hamish, let's start with you and talk about the early Antonioni. Did he start? I'm looking. It says his first Gente de Poe, I guess is how you'd pronounce it, and I think I saw that on one of his videos or one of his DVDs. That was, I guess, his first documentary, and it was made, I guess, it looks like probably right after. Was it made before Italy switched sides, or not?
Yeah, look, just before I get to that, because obviously it's very important in terms of not only his career, but Italian neorealism, as we call it. Just to get back to something Richard was saying, though, the Germans were actually starting to do a very equivalent kind of filmmaking after the war. But we have to remember that the German film industry, was obviously destroyed during the war, but the former studios, the massive studios, UFA most famously, were either destroyed or ended up, of course, in what we later called East Germany. So one of the important things about German cinema after the war is that, in fact, East German cinema got going, as in general happened with the economy and so forth, much more quickly than West Germany. And I don't know if you guys got it in the US, but there was a fabulous sort of mini retrospective of East German cinema about 10 years ago now. It was only a handful of films, but it was a real eye-opener for a lot of people. How quickly the industry got back on its feet, but also how complex and interesting many of those films were in reflecting on.
What's interesting is how often the filmmakers worked in both East and West Germany. Someone like Wolfgang Schneider, for example, went back and forth.
Indeed, yeah.
So once the wall happened, then they couldn't do that. But up until then, there's a lot of sharing of talent and screenwriters and all kinds of things.
That's right, and the important link too between Germany and Italy is that many of the great filmmakers were either communists or some kind of leftists. And in the case of Germany, of course, anyone who had survived the war and who was living in the East, or as you say, was moving across both, who was of that kind of political bent, could actually make films exploring a kind of leftist history and a leftist account of the war. And of course, as we know, irrespective of our politics, the communists often were making, I guess you could say slightly more defendable films about the war, only in the sense that they had a moral leg to stand on vis-a-vis the long fight against fascism. So if we move to Italy, this is very much the case, clearly. So a generation of partisan fighters loosely associated with various left-wing groups, and in some cases, like in the case of Visconti, for example, overtly communist. These guys finally got to make features toward the end of the war, and went on to make, of course, some of the great masterpieces of Italian cinema. So I think that's another, in addition to what Richard was saying about the huge export success of the neo-realist films, is also the fact that after the war in Italy, the Communist Party and more broadly the left-wing kind of groups had enormous moral authority, and they came very close to winning the 1948 elections. And in a sense, they had this kind of a cultural, particularly in the North, a kind of a cultural cachet that really lasted for a very long time. In parts of Italy are still governed by some derivation of one of the initial communist parties. In the case of Antonioni's work with his first film, People of the Po Valley, he started work on it in 1943, as far as I understand. Sorry, 42, as far as I understand. I'm not sure exactly which month, but together with Ossessione, Visconti's great first feature, it's often credited as sort of kicking off what we would now understand as neorealism, which for some people is ironic in the sense that I tend to agree with Richard here. I think that the difference between Antonioni's work and what we understand as neorealism is often far too kind of simplistically insisted upon. Obviously, if you look at a film like Red Desert or Zabriskie Point, we do seem to be a long way from the edicts of neorealism. But I would argue, if you look at the film sequentially, and I've argued this extensively in the article I referred to earlier on the Tetralogy, what Antonioni does is he responds to reality as it is changing. And it's changing so quickly in Italy and in Europe more generally, but arguably in Italy, particularly so, that he has no choice in a sense but to try and adapt the visual language and the aesthetic language that his films use in an increasingly radical way. So to make a film, say, that looks like The Bicycle Thieves in 1958, let alone 1968, would be kind of ridiculous if we keep that kind of historical responsibility and engagement in mind. So I think that's the way to look at even the most clearly quote-unquote neo-realist films of his career, like People of the Po Valley and some of those early documentaries.
I know I did a show on Stanley Kubrick a couple of months ago, and we did a segment where we talked about Kubrick's early documentaries, and you could see the prefiguration of what was to come in his fiction films and some of his documentaries. There's the famous scene in, I think it was his second feature, where there's a negative image going down the streets of New York. I think I forget it's the one where the guy is in the mannequin factory, and there's a shot like that, and there's a shot like that in one of his industrial documentary films that's almost a carbon copy done 3 or 4 years earlier. So was the documentary of work of Antonioni also prefigurative in things, or was it just straight propaganda?
I think it's more straight propaganda. I mean, I think it seems to me that what those filmmakers were doing was beginning to use cinema in a way to really explore, as Amy said, the kind of reality that was around them. And, in a sense, again, because the cinema was a little bit of a liberated zone. I mean, Vittorio Mussolini wasn't an idiot. He knew he was hiring, but he also thought these people have talent. So it was a kind of interesting balance in terms of the way that these filmmakers had to work. It's the great debate now is if you look at Rossellini's films made under the fascists. I mean, these were films that were made on order. And yet, I think if you look at A Pilot Returns, one of his films, it can be read all kinds of ways. It can be read as a real critique of the fascists, and yet was completely paid for by the Italian military. So there's a lot of contradictions like that. You just can't say, here was the regime, here's the film that was made. People worked in many different capacities and often quite subtly.
And of course, Antonioni was the chief screenwriter on that film. Yeah. And the important thing to realize too is that fascist regimes, even Nazi Germany itself, don't necessarily produce an enormous amount of propaganda. I mean, the films that we know, the notorious films, of course, can be described that way. But when historians first started to hold their noses and do serious studies of Nazi cinema, they found that most of it was pretty much Hollywood-style melodramas, with a few typical or more kind of, Germanic variants of the mountain climbing genre and stuff. But, very few of the films were kind of what we would call overt propaganda. And the same could be said, but even more so, I think, of the Italian cinema under Mussolini. I mean, the so-called white telephone drama that the neo-realists were purportedly rebelling against was really the Italian version or versions of, kind of privileged American genre cinema, with some interesting, obviously, kind of contextual changes there. In terms of Antonioni's documentaries that he made, well, really, he in fact only made, or started to make the first one during the Mussolini period. And, you know, it's even arguable over whether that film was being shot at that time. The film itself was not completed until 1947. We're talking about people of the Po Valley still here. And it was never completed as it was intended. So I think the running time of the film eventually was pretty short, maybe about 10 minutes or thereabouts. And it was supposed to be much longer. Watched as a kind of adjunct to A Sessione, Visconti's film, it is a really, really striking work. And getting back to your question, Dan, if you look at Antonioni's documentaries, they, you know, it's almost impossible not to view them through this kind of prefiguration idea. What's interesting, though, is that they don't just prefigure the famous films. So, for example, you know, the Po Valley clearly prefigures Il Grido in its use of that location, but the atmospherics and everything. But some of the other shorter films, like Superstition and I can't remember the title of the film, but the one about magazines and matinee idols and so forth. These films prefigure a real interest in pop culture that Antonioni would explore, particularly in his 1950s films, and would return obviously with Blow Up, but to some extent is in abeyance in some of his most famous films, particularly those early 60s ones. So yes, the documentaries are a map in some ways of what would happen, but in kind of complicated ways too.
You also have sequences in films like Eclipse, like we say, where, you know, for example, the stock market sequence, you know, which is all staged, but it really stands as an incredible record of what the Italian stock market was like in the early 1960s. So it's always, I think, that what you might call documentary impulse that's behind Antonioni. I think in many ways he really does want to capture Italy as it is.
Yeah, I mean, the Australian critic and scholar who just died recently, Sam Rody, who wrote a wonderful book on Antonioni that came out in 1990, I think. His argument, or one of his arguments about all of Antonioni's films, is that they're all documentaries. And he says even the films that seem to have a fiction or a narrative, he argues, are really documentaries or fictions. They're documenting not only certain spaces and certain kind of, you know, cultural and historical change, but they're also documenting all of the artifice and all of the kind of mechanisms of narrative cinema, and even something like Red Desert that appears to be so artificial and abstract, he sees through this lens. So, you know, you can actually really kind of push this idea quite far.
People have made that same argument about Godard, saying that Godard's 60s films are far and away the best documentary films made of France at that time.
Sure, yeah.
Well, let's talk about the fictional films. I see that he made 5 of them.
Excuse me, please.
Oh, go ahead.
This is Mike Gross.
Yeah.
I've been waiting.
Okay. Go ahead, Mike.
Cue to talk about the documentaries.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, okay. There's a lot to say about them. They're some of Antonioni's best films. They do prefigure lots of important ideas and techniques that show up in his later movies. You can see Antonioni's, one of his great interests throughout much of his career is people who are experts on technology or industry. In many ways, he was a very early representative of what we would today call geek culture, where people who are interested in the world of technology, invention, industry around them. And this is a very strong interest in the early films. You see, especially the one, his industrial documentary called Seven Reeds, One Dress, Sette Cane, Un Vestito, is a brilliantly made film about a factory showing the manufacture of early version of rayon viscose in Datia. It's very interesting. It's full of enormously complicated visual patterns, rotating machinery. It's an early example of Antonioni's interest in circular forms, circular buildings, and circular machinery, which is a major visual pattern that runs through almost all of his work. It's also a direct ancestor to Red Desert, in that both of them a very detailed look at the reality of Italian industry, what it looked like, what it felt like, what effects it has on human beings. So it's a direct ancestor there.
I think that's really important. Keep going.
Okay, another important ancestry you can see in the films is his interest, as Hamish was saying, in popular culture, that the film about called The Loving Lie, or L'Amorosa Menzogna, in my Italian's very poor, I apologize, is the film about the fumetti industry. They're like comic books or graphic novels in Italy, only they're based in photographs made of live models, which are then modified into pictures and have dialogue balloons added. They're very much like a comic book, but they're sort of a cross between a comic book and a movie made out of still photographs. So they're somewhat unique to Italy. As far as I know, they've never had a big impact in English-speaking countries, but they're
all over Latin America and many other places too. It's a very common form in many parts of Europe.
Okay, so it's a wonderful movie. Antonioni clearly loved fumetti, and he shows the Italian people being absolutely passionate in their enthusiasm for fumetti, and the interest in addition to people who are experts on technology and industry, the other great type of character in Antonioni are people in the arts. Writers, painters, photographers, and so on. And this is an early example of where this interest in Antonioni emerges, where he shows people of just enormous passionate interest in the arts. There's a sequence in The Loving Lie which shows various ordinary working Italians passionately engaged in reading fumetti, and it anticipates the scenes in L'Avventura where the people are in the art gallery and shown with just enormous rapt interest in the serious paintings in the art gallery. So Antonioni's got this view. It extends both to high art, serious art of paintings in a gallery, and also to the popular culture of fumetti here. They're both treated in the same non-ironical total love of art fashion here. Another thing that Antonioni told interviewers that he discovered camera movement in his first feature film, Story of a Love Affair, which I'm sure we're going to be discussing in a minute. And there's certainly tons of remarkable camera movement in that and his other 50s fiction films, but you can already see lots and lots of camera movement in The Loving Lie. Antonioni, which was made, a couple years before the Story of a Love Affair, Antonioni was very clearly deeply fascinated by camera movement and incorporating it in The Loving Lie as a major part of his film work. Going to talk one more thing about one other film. I do love People of the Po. That is a beautiful movie, and the scenes at the end where the storm is about to start are very beautiful. They anticipate all the scenes of mist and rain and other. But I would like to mention his NU, which is a documentary about the street cleaners in Rome, I believe. It's an early example of Antonioni's respect for and interest in working class work, and that's something that runs through all of his films very strongly. In the Seven Reeds, One Dress, you see the technical workers at the factory. They're skilled laborers. They're experts on the high technology of 1948. Antonioni is different from most contemporary geek culture, where they always show, in most films today, scientists are always shown as very middle class people, white collar people, and so on. And you get people like that very much in Antonioni. He's very interested in them, but he also recognizes that working class people in factories and utilities and things like this also had expertise on technology. You see it in his movies.
Okay.
So another aspect you'd see that starts out with the narrator talking about, says that people often look at the street cleaners in Rome but don't understand their work and barely see them. And this concept of looking at things but not understanding them is a almost philosophical issue that shows up in later Antonioni. I mean, it's classic in Blow Up, where the photographer sees what's going on in the park in real life, but doesn't begin to even remotely understand it till much later on when he blows up his photographs of it. And you'll see it also in the beginning of La Notte, where the dying scholar in the hospital is worried that he didn't think deeply enough about what he was doing, that he was afraid to look deep and go deep in ideas. This is a related concept of people looking at things, not understanding, thinking about them, but thinking too superficially. It's a profound worry of Antonioni's that, or a view that runs through his films. And we'll see some other examples later in Evinti. The newspaper is called the Daily Witness. So the newspaper, the clueless reporter in that film keeps looking at things, but is always, two steps behind what he should be in terms of understanding himself.
Well, go ahead, Hamish.
That's a really lovely coverage of the documentaries, I think. And the last point that you've just given us there is a great kind of handle on which, or upon which, many people have tried to understand Antonioni's entire work. And of course, it fits into really a whole definition of modernism in the arts more generally, but even in literature, which is this kind of idea, and you enunciated it so well, that vision and looking at things is actually now not linked to knowledge, or at least it's linked to a kind of mystification and obfuscation, which doesn't, in fact, kind of give us that sense of empowerment. So the jargon that people often use is that, the link between vision and knowledge brings in this case it's broken down. So we have a kind of an epistemological crisis almost, if you like. And I think I think you're right, NU is the key kind of moment really early in his work where that is prefigured, and he never stops doing it in all of his films. This incredible celebration of visuality and looking, but at the same time a disempowering of it, which is really remarkable. As I say, it fits into a much bigger modernist story, but I would argue at least no one in the cinema pursues it as presciently and as relentlessly as Antonioni.
Well, let's
we have the confusion between the saying I see, meaning both I visualize something and also I understand it. Not every European language has that, but it is particularly noted in English, and I think goes along with kind of separation between self and world, which I think is really one of the things that's at the heart of your book, Hamish.
Well, Mike, since you mentioned Story of a Love Affair, let's talk about the 550s films up to L'Avventura, and to end this segment. You had made a comment about Story of a Love Affair, so why don't you tell us, why don't you kick off this portion and just tell us a little bit about those 5 films, any thematic or visual things that first flowered in that period. Go ahead, Mike.
Yes. The first of his films, A Story of a Love Affair, and it has elements both of detective fiction and realism. The first half of the film is a mystery story where where the detective is trying to research the heroine's hidden past and find out more and more about it. The second half is a realistic account of her romantic affairs. So it's a film it's sort of a cross between genre fiction, the detective story, and the realism, which is in a direct line of the neorealism that other people have used in Italian cinema. You can certainly see influences in the second half of Assessione, which Hamish has been marking as very clearly a milestone in the neorealism cinema. That's an important influence. You can see a direct influence of that on Story of a Love Affair, and later on in El Grido, The Cry, which is the last of his 50s films. They're both films which have lots of direct echoes of Assessione. So there's this fusion in Antonioni between neorealism and detective fiction, which plays a big role throughout his work. He made a trilogy of crime stories about three young murderers called I Vinti, the Vanquished or the Losers might be a better translation of the title. And then, of course, in Blow Up has a major mystery story element as well in it. So it's this is not too. There's a prose tradition here as well of fusing highbrow concepts with mystery fiction, and you can see things like in writers like G.K. Chesterton, Karl Čapek, are writers who are clearly part of the same, perhaps European tradition of the highbrow detective story. Some thoughts here about some aspects of the 50s films.
Okay, Hamish or Richard, do you want to pick up on that?
Richard?
I think Story of a Love Affair is in many ways a film that does look decidedly different from much of what was happening in Italy at that time. I mean, by 1950, there had been a move away from neorealism, and that very few of the films made any money. So because of that, there was a kind of new tendency, I think, towards moving towards other sorts of cinema. But, I think there are strong elements in it of neorealism, some of the things that Mike pointed out now. Certainly for me, though, I think what really is remarkable is just his conception of the shot. I mean, already I think he is working with an idea, with a notion of the shot itself, which again and again is really challenging for the era and really anticipates so much of the work that would go on in the 1960s. In fact, doesn't really, I think, move back to that sort of real work with the shot until much later, but this film has an incredible sense of not only duration, but the complexity of each shot, the way that he is, mise-en-scène just finds each shot in such a way that enormous amounts of things happen. Characters enter the frame as friends, leave as enemies. I mean, all kinds of things that go on in that film, which I think are really quite remarkable and amazingly sophisticated. I mean, in a way, it's a real leap from the documentaries, which I think have their quality and certainly have their echoes in later work. But I think it is one of the most stunning debuts in film history.
Hamish?
Look, it certainly is. I mean, when Andre Bazin saw this film, he viewed it as a real sign of what he was kind of calling for. I mean, if you read Bazin's work on his, endlessly quoted work on neorealism, it's easy to assume that Bazin is just celebrating a kind of naive historical responsiveness and a kind of spatial charting. But there's another Bazin, a very important Bazin nestled in there as well, which is a kind of proto-modernist. And it would have been so marvelous to hear what he would have said about L'Avventura, La Notte, these films, if he'd lived to write about them, and to try and sort of, join those dots, if you like. I mean, the fascination he had for Chronicle of Love is obvious in one sense, in that, as Richard's already alluded to, there's an incredible, at least for the time, elongation of the shot and a kind of a stress on real space and depth compositions, which I tend to agree with Richard and others. He would, in a way, step back from to some extent in the following films and wouldn't really explode again in quite the same way, or in a different way, until Il Grido many years later. So it's really interesting how radical he is with this first film, despite the fact that he's in fact giving us, compared to many of the later films, of course, much more narrative here than we would be used to later on. However, going back to something that Mike was saying, the use of the detective story here is so typical of his work, in the sense that, the mystery or the murder mystery here is never fully kind of clarified. I mean, there's this wonderful ambiguity over whether the lovers are murderers or not, and in a way that they feel guilty. So in that sense, they are. But in both, the murder or the possible murder that predates the film, and which is kind of, inadvertently sort of discovered by the detective, is, of course, again, there's kind of a not murder that happens later in the film, which, again, they feel guilty for. So even in this first film, Antonioni is using what is traditionally a genre which is all about knowledge, all about achieving knowledge, and he undermines it even on the basic level of plot, which is pretty striking.
Hamish, does that possibly prefigure, you think, L'Avventura, where a third or 40% of the way into the story, one of the main characters disappears, and slowly but surely, the two main characters seemingly go on a hunt for her, but then they sort of forget that she even exists?
Yeah, for sure, definitely. I mean, the genre elements will gradually disappear throughout his 1950s work, and on the one hand, disappear completely with L'Avventura. Other people, of course, have argued what Antonioni is doing in his mature work is what's sometimes called the modernist melodrama, or the kind of melodrama with all of the traditional excess taken out of it, but with the sentiment still there. Let's remember Antonioni described the trilogy, at least, as a trilogy of sentiments. And when he moves on to Il Deserto Rosso and then the English language films, in a way he leaves that world behind completely. So it's, the evolution's complex, of course, yeah.
Well, let me just ask finally about Il Grido, because that's the only one of the 50s films that I've seen. And I know the star of that was Steve Cochran, an American quote-unquote B actor. And I know later, in Zabriskie Point, he used non-actors. In the 50s films, did he sometimes, like a lot of the neorealists, use non-actors in those films, or were they mostly professionals?
By and large, they're professionals. I don't think using non-actors was one of Antonioni's, I don't want to say strong points, but one of his tendencies. And Steve Cochran was like a lot of other Americans at that time. There was a lot of work in Italy. It was a big industry, and the Italians dubbed. So it didn't matter what language you spoke. You could go and be in a film and whatever. So you find a lot of American actors. I mean, Richard Basehart, actually a British actor, popping up in La Strada. So there are a lot of people who kind of make these films because, of course, they didn't have to speak Italian.
Okay. Richard Harris, of course, in Red Desert, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Anthony Quinn in La Strada.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mike, do you have any final comments before we move on to,
Steve Cochran was probably there so Antonioni could get funding in some ways. There are a lot of, like, Fellini made a couple of films with American actors, and I've always had the impression that there was funding things where they would feel this would help them break into the world market and make the film more popular around the world to have a name. Steve Cochran's very good. He's typically, in most of his American films, he plays working class men and very convincingly. And he was a number of people like George Raft who were associated with, or Chuck Connors who were associated with a working class background. And that certainly, it's very important in El Grido because he's playing a character who is such a working class man. He also played men who were very emotionally vulnerable and were easily obsessed with various women. You'll see that in a lot of his films like White Heat and Private Health 36 Made in America. And that's also very important because he's playing a character in El Grido who has a truly massive nervous breakdown when he's deserted by his long-term girlfriend of 7 years, quite understandably. So it's he gives a good performance, and Antonioni is able to work with him and develop a very believable character for him.
You bring up a good point. I know Fellini was associated with Cinecittà and Svensk Film back Bergman. Did Antonioni work within a studio system, or was he financed independently? Anyone?
Cinecittà is just the name of a studio. I mean, it's not the name of a company.
Okay.
So, I mean, basically, it was a place you went, you rented space, and you made films.
Okay.
Antonioni worked for a variety of Italian production companies. I'm not sure off the top of my head who produced Il Grido, but that was very standard at the time. Some people either set up their own companies, or if they were successful, worked, progressively or continuously, I should say, with the same company. Others kind of moved from company to company. So it was different ways of doing that.
Well, let's end this segment, and we'll go in our next segment. We'll talk from L'Avventura onward. So we'll do that in a moment. All right, back to talk about the trilogy of films, or possibly tetralogy of films that came in the 1960s that basically made Antonioni a household name, at least in some circles, along with the Kurosawas and the Fellinis and the Bergmans. L'Avventura is generally seen as sort of the film that establishes reputation. And yesterday I was doing a show on the career of Woody Allen, and in a sense, even though they're totally different films, it's sort of to Antonioni what Annie Hall was, I think, for Allen, and that it made his name, and it was, while a continuation in some ways, it seemed to a lot of people think of it as him finally coming to full maturity and becoming a great artist. So I don't know if any. Let me start. Go left to right. I'll start with Hamish, since you had grouped L'Avventura along with Red Desert and La Notte and L'Eclisse as a tetralogy. Let's talk about L'Avventura first, and those 3 or 4 films that you'd lump together.
Well, I mean, certainly, most people in the United States and many other countries, their first encounter with Antonioni was L'Avventura, which is important in a lot of ways. I mean, it's like it's not perhaps today's most radical film, but historically it certainly was. It made a more serious break, I think, than any of his other films at that time. However, for people who have been following his career, particularly in France, where he, starting from that initial write-up by Bazin in 1950-51, he'd been taken quite seriously, although none of the films were huge hits. L'Avventura wasn't a radical surprise, if you're familiar with his work. I mean, Il Grido really starts to open things up. It kind of finishes the 1950s work that we were just talking about. But there's also important links here. I mean, not only vis-a-vis the way Il Grido really starts to kind of evacuate narrative energy and narrative movement, so that in some ways, like the second half of De Sica's The Bicycle Thieves 10 years earlier, the first half of the film, Il Grido, this is full of, potential narrative and even genre kind of excitement. There's a kind of a nascent melodrama there about family breakdown. But the last 2/3 of the film are an increasingly sort of quote-unquote aimless wandering throughout the Po region. And so this model, I think, we see again in L'Avventura in more radical form. The other connection, though, that I would make is that many of the 1950s films deal explicitly with themes of what you could loosely call kind of nihilism. There's a real interest in Antonioni's work across different classes, and in the early films, as I think we've already alluded to, he's also very interested in working class culture and characters, an interest that would kind of disappear to some extent in the later work. But what he shows is that people from many different sort of social backgrounds all struggle often with different versions of a kind of I guess you could loosely say a question of kind of purpose. And Il Grido is an incredibly bleak film on this level. So I think while the themes of particularly the motif of suicide, which is very important in many of those 50s films, would disappear pretty much with L'Avventura, I think the broader theme of a kind of the challenge of nihilism is there. What, of course, makes L'Avventura so modern, not only aesthetically but conceptually, is that there is no suicide. There is no longer any kind of resort to remotely romantic or kind of miserableist conclusion. And the famous ending of L'Avventura is this kind of acceptance of continuation. But certainly, as we started the show talking about, the impact of L'Avventura, both at the time and now, is pretty undeniable.
Mike Ross, do you have a comment on L'Avventura?
Yes, I agree that it's perhaps the Antonioni's greatest film. It's a masterpiece. The whole tetralogy is some of the peak moments of the cinema. It's you could talk a little bit about the mystery plot here. It's famously a mystery without a solution, which is still very rare in film mysteries. There's some historical antecedents in prose mystery fiction. I mentioned Karl Čapek earlier. His collection of mystery stories. He was a Czech writer, intellectual writer. His collection of mystery stories called Tales from Both Pockets from the late 1920s. He has 3 short stories in it which propound mysteries, but which frustratingly don't solve the mysteries at the end. And this is a start of a tradition you'll see in Climax of La Ventura. I suspect one of the reasons that it was famously booed at Cannes is that the audience came to an end of watching the movie without learning anything about the mystery that they've been following quite intently through the whole film. The film comes to an end in spoilers alert here, you learn nothing about the truth about anything that's happened so far, which was very radical. It's a form of modernism coming to the mystery. As I say, there's antecedents in Chopik. You can also see antecedents with a mystery novel that's not very well known nowadays by Clifford Knight called The Affair of the Scarlet Crab, which is a story which takes place on an expedition to the Galapagos Islands, a scientific expedition, and it does involve some mysterious disappearances. They do get solved at the end, but throughout most of the novel, they're as frustrating and as maddening as the mystery in La Ventura. You have no idea if when the person has disappeared, whether they've been murdered or whether they've simply fled away in hiding, or whether they killed themselves or met with a sinister accident or whatever here. And the people who are left behind them face a tremendous challenge trying to respond to such a horribly ambiguous situation. So a couple thoughts of La Ventura. Also, it's just extraordinarily beautiful work. The landscape photography of the islands and the rocks and the sea is just some of the loveliest in film history. It's enormously creative. It shows a masterful compositional style. It's just a very, very visually beautiful movie and beautiful at all levels.
Well, let me ask you, Mike, since you mentioned the mysteries. I know the thing about La Ventura, and I think of the 3 films, it's the most overrated one. And when I first saw it, I thought it was overrated, not because I really cared about the mystery, but you can go away. I mean, if you look, I think the same year Psycho came out, and we get the first quarter of that film, seeming it like it's going to be a conventional Hollywood heist film or mystery, and then we get the introduction of Anthony Perkins's character, and that successfully works. And I'm not the biggest Hitchcock fan, but that's one of his best films, and it works because you get into the character, you get into why he's doing this, and we don't really need the resolution of what would have happened with was it Marion Crane or whatever the character's name was. With La Ventura, I didn't mind him going away from what happened with the girl, but we just get sort of these two main characters that are these nihilistic, narcissistic characters that just don't do anything. You don't really care about them at the end. Whereas, for example, in the next film, La Notte, the two main leads, you get so deep and into the character, you really care about them. And I think that's one of the great films about relationships ever made. So what? Let me just ask you, Mike, before I go to Richard. What do you think about? Do you agree, or I guess you disagree, since you think that La Ventura is a great film?
Well, no, I have to agree with you that the characters, especially the man, is that archetypal 1950s character in La Ventura, the playboy, weak-willed, spineless, easily corrupted. It's a type. You see it in other films like John Ford's The Last Hurrah. You see it in comic books. You know, Bruce Wayne's Secret Identity of Playboy. Bruce Wayne's The Playboy Secret Identity of Batman. It's a type that Americans and people all over the world just despise. And you do see very weak-willed, superficial people in it, which is not true in La Notte. You see, they're great human beings, the couple there. So what you're saying is true, that Antonioni worked with a very, very wide range of characters, and he would, some of them were very admirable, and some of them were rotten to the core.
Richard, do you have a comment on La Ventura?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things about La Ventura, it's a little bit like, a few other films like, say, Breathless, which came out around the same time. Sometimes a little bit hard for us to really understand the shock that the audience at the time had when they saw the films, because obviously we've seen so much after that. I mean, even I first saw L'Avventura probably late 1960s. By then, I had seen a number of Godard films, I had seen Rene films, I had seen a number of things which prepared me for it. And still, I thought it was a pretty remarkable film. What it was like to that audience that saw it in Cannes in 1960, you know, I can only imagine, in the same way that what shock Breathless must have had, or a few other films like that in the course of film history. So it's a little bit hard for us to, I think, put us in that particular place. I do agree with Hamish that I think it's a tetralogy. I know there's some argument about whether or not the first three should be considered on their own. Seems to me that, you know, Red Desert's the perfect addition and complement for the first three, even though it's in color. It seems to be, you know, I think probably the overriding difference in a way. As much as Antonioni explored camera movement in Chronicle or Story of a Love Affair, here I think what he really begins, this is something that characterizes the whole tetralogy, is a kind of really interesting work with what you might think of as elliptical editing, where there's a sense in which our transition from shot to shot is often quite surprising and startling. It's never to the point where we don't know where we are, but there's always as if something is missing. We've gone from one shot to something else, and while it assumes the same characters, the same location, clearly something is missing. Something's been taken out. The New York Times reviewer for L'Avventura actually wrote that the film felt as if a reel had been misplaced. And I understand that sort of feeling, but I think it works even more on the kind of individual level of shot than it does sort of perhaps as an overall narrative structure. That idea of a kind of elliptical editing, which for me would reach its height in Eclipse. I think that's really the film where that particular technique of Antonioni reached an extraordinary level of effectiveness.
Can I just say something about that? Antonioni's influence has only kind of grown in terms of, you know, critical and scholarly acknowledgement. And one of the things that people speak about is its connection, and I alluded to it before, to so-called, what's often called sort of the slow cinema movement of recent decades. That's very important in Taiwanese cinema, even mainland Chinese filmmakers like Jia Zhongke, and also, of course, you know, European filmmakers like Bela Tarr. And I love a lot of those filmmakers' work, but one of the things that really strikes me is exactly what Richard is saying, which is that, yes, at times, obviously, I mean, Antonioni is a huge figure in terms of stretching time, literally forcing us to feel time in this kind of slowed down way. But what he also does is something that many of these more recent sort of time image filmmakers don't do, or at least don't do nearly to the same radical degree, is an incredible regime of editing. I mean, you know, that much celebrated sequence in L'Avventura when Sandro and Claudia go to the sort of the ghost town, you know, the fascist era village. I mean, you know, that is you know, it's almost like ground zero of his whole technique, in the sense of you have these shots, you have a couple of shots that go for, you know, quote unquote too long, but then that really famous creeping shot down the alleyway that sort of almost now looks like something out of David Lynch or something, you know, and many other kind of slightly eerie filmmakers. But following that shot, of course, is this extraordinary cut into, you know, what we now call, or, you know, what we then call kind of lovemaking. And, you know, a whole film has been lost in that cut. You know, the conversion of this very uneasy, slightly flirtatious relationship into an affair. And Gilles Deleuze, in the time image book, Cinema 2, he describes L'Avventura and Antonioni's work more generally as doing something that he says only Orson Welles pursued to the same extent, and that is really exploring Friedrich Nietzsche's kind of challenge of engaging with the problem of nihilism. And I think to get back to the audience reaction at Cannes in 1960, we can almost psychoanalyze their response now. It's very easy to laugh at them, obviously, because, you know, it's like, well, you know, you thought Monica Vitti running down the hallway at Taormina was slow. Well, check out, you know, the Turin horse or something. But if we think about why they were so outraged, you know, surely to some extent it might be because what the film does is it makes you transfer your affection or your allegiance or your interest onto this new couple whose relationship is only possible because this woman has died or disappeared, and this relationship can only continue if, in effect, they start to flee her or flee her presence. And, you know, that the horrible nature of that as a viewer, I think, or the confronting nature of that at the very least, is something that I don't think is quite leftist when we rewatch the film now. So I guess I'd emphasize those two things. What Richard is saying about the elliptical cut, and of course a very different kind of ellipsis to the kind that you get in classical Hollywood cinema where you're not supposed to notice the cut. And also the kind of the shock factor of the very insidious kind of narrative treatment of the couple. And also, of course, backing up very much what Mark was saying about just the incredible, I'd say, kind of sublime level of kind of image construction that the film has, actually more than any of his other films, if you think about the variety of locations and treatment of space and staging of bodies. It's kind of unparalleled, really.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned Bellatar in a sense is sort of the end point of at least the long take that Antonioni began. I'm not considering Andy Warhol and those experimental films. I'm talking about, you know, strictly, fictive. Yeah. But let me move on to La Notte, since I had said I think that I would put that probably even ahead of Scenes from a Marriage by Bergman, as I think one of the greatest portrayals of a realistic marriage, a troubled realistic marriage. And I think the only performance that Mastroianni gives that's in a class with that throughout his whole career, and I've seen about 10 or 12 of his films, is in La Dolce Vita. What, if any one of you want to jump in about that film, any thoughts? Hamish, let's start with you then.
Look, I love La Notte. I do think on most levels it is a step down from Love and Tutor. However, in terms of there's so many great things about it. I think in a way, though, what Antonioni is doing is he's making a tighter and a more glamorous and actually a much more star-studded film. I mean, of course, Monica Vitti became a huge star with La Ventura, but she was not, obviously, when the film was made. Here he is in La Notte with Mastroianni and Jean Moreau, you know, two of the biggest stars, maybe even the biggest stars in European cinema. And he's making a pretty glamorous production. Now, what he's doing with that, if you like, language is remarkable. La Notte is a very strange film, though, because on the surface, I think, yes, in a way, it looks more conventional, at least compared to La Ventura, and it seems to tell a more narratively compact story. But if we think about what really does happen in the film, again, we've got this initial energy, you know, of the scenario with the dying friend Tommaso, and then this kind of, you know, couple in crisis. And then, of course, pretty early in the film, Lydia goes on her famous walk. And then all of a sudden we're in this complete kind of pure world of non-narrative Antonioni cinema, where it's all about the walk in this case and the gaze. And again, this kind of passive version of the gaze, where Lydia is looking at Milano, the central district, and then further out, and she's looking, you know, at all these different kind of environments, but in no way is she possessing them or kind of discovering anything tangible about them.
Mike, go ahead, Richard.
Go with Michael if you want.
Oh, Mike, go ahead. You comment on La Notte?
Yes, I agree. The walk with Lydia is just a beautiful, beautiful example of pure filmmaking, and it shows so. Antonioni had a great gift for photographic architecture in a creative way. He's a very much like Fritz Lang. He's an architectural director, and he's got all of Milan to work with in here. So he has a field day photographing it. This also has the rocket section, which shows Antonioni's interest in technology. These are young men who are doing rockets. This was right in the middle. This is the same year, 1960. This is just after we have Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, and before people are going to orbit the Earth here from the U.S. space program. So he's very much reflecting this sort of science fictional or advancing technology interest in this section. It's very beautiful. It's got one of his gas stations, which is subject he loves to film. That's a very technological locale. And once again, he was probably influenced by Visconti's filming of a gas station in Sessione. There's beautiful marks on the ground that are on roads that are designed for traffic, making geometrical patterns out of them. You'd also see those early in La Ventura and other places in Antonioni's cinema. There's park-like regions. He's got a long interest in parks. Seems to me that park does show up and blow up and maybe plays a bit of a role there. That's his most famous park, but they're everywhere in Antonioni's films. It shows his visual abilities here in a very great fashion.
I should also mention, of course, that the party sequence at the end is the last half of the film. An extraordinary, elongated set piece that really is like a distillation in a very different way, of course, of a certain kind of culture, which even more famously, Federico Fellini had essayed only a year or so before in La Dolce Vita. And I happened to watch La Dolce Vita only a week or two ago. And great film as it is, it seems to be so much more of a distended and for me at least a kind of relatively unfocused film in certain respects. La Notte is almost a vicious film by comparison, particularly in that last half.
Richard?
Yeah, I would say that La Notte is for me probably the least satisfying film of the tetralogy, even though I think it's a great film in lots of ways. Perhaps I think, one of the things you have to remember with someone like Antonioni is, the French have a term, cinéma de recherche, research cinema. It sounds very scientific, but in a way what it means is really filmmakers who each film explores something different, try something new in a way. And I think that was Antonioni. Again, something that you can begin to trace his work, we begin to see it in La Ventura, but I think really reaches its sort of fruition in this film is the kind of what you might think of as constant pull and tug in Antonioni between, on the one hand, the overarching aspect of narrative and the interest in moment by moment. And in a sense, that's what I think Lydia's Walk is. I mean, where something comes up, suddenly dominates the film. It has almost nothing to do with what the film in one kind of narrative sense is about. And Antonioni, again, is playing with that idea. How can I, on one hand, tell an overarching kind of narrative, and on the other hand, really focus people moment to moment in such a way that those moments really don't add up to the kind of narrative that people are expecting. And so La Notte seems to me very interesting in that aspect. Some of the things about the relationship, for me, I guess leave me a little cold or seem a little less thought out than perhaps they seem in Eclipse. I mean, I think Eclipse is a much more successful film. Again, La Notte is a great film, and would that all films were as unsuccessful in that way as La Notte. But, that's not the case. But if we are making comparisons here, it does seem to me that perhaps because it is between these two real signposts, La Ventura and Eclipse, is the film where maybe he's trying things out a little bit that haven't quite reached their full, what would you say, expressionistic power.
Well, let's
we should also say here that I think that La Notte, actually more overtly than either of its, La Ventura or L'Eclisse, is explicitly about a very particular kind of milieu. This film is about Milan and about the kind of contrasting, sort of interests, if you like, broadly speaking, the business class. We're talking about the most economically successful city in Italy, and then a kind of an intellectual class or a cultured class that is, to some extent on the wane. And, one of the many ways to think about the tetralogy is the kind of the gradual diminution of the kind of intellectual or cultured and in some ways also politically left-wing elements in Italy at that time, again, starting from that very powerful position straight after the war with the enormous moral authority of the communists and other elements. So, for example, the fact in L'Eclisse that Riccardo, the boyfriend that Monica Vitti is leaving, is some kind of left-wing intellectual with kind of Marxist journals and stuff on his desk, and she ends up with Piero, who's a stockbroker and presumably more of a kind of pro-capitalist kind of guy. This is part of the charting that Antonioni is doing. So La Notte is very important in this way. It's about the gradual losing out, really, of a certain vision of Italian culture in favour of a much more purely capitalist one. So that scene where the industrialist offers Giovanni a job is one of the most pathetic scenes in Antonioni's work. That Mastiani is sitting there thinking, okay, I'm a writer and I write for intellectual journals, and I'm being offered a job to write essentially pro-business propaganda for this guy.
Okay, Richard, since you have posited Leclerc as the best of the three films, let me start with you and then work backwards to Michael and Hamish. So, why do you think that's the best of of those three films?
I guess I find it the most affecting and effective. I mean, I think that all the work that Antonioni was experimenting, actually starting with Il Grido, going through L'Avventura, and now to La Notte, just reached a kind of beautiful fruition in this film. I think he has his sense of editing down. I think Vitti gives an extraordinary performance. I think it has a kind of moral and, sort of political weight to it. I mean, the whole sort of picture of the stock market. And again, it's just seeing a work that I think finally, encapsulates everything that Antonioni was trying at that particular point to do. And again, it's, just in my experience, while I think sometimes I've screened the film for students, L'Avventura, for example, and some people like it or whatever, people are always bowled over by Eclipse. I mean, here's a film that's 50 years old or more, and I think it's just as powerful and just as radical today as it was when it came out. So I think that is also something that I've always been impressed with the film, the way in which, even though this film is, again, 50 years old, it continues to have the same sort of power I've discovered with students that say Shannon Ballou House or something like that. There are very few films that keep their edge that long.
Mike, since you were talking earlier about form and movement, Leclerc would probably be right up your alley.
Yes, it's a great film, and I was interested in hearing about how they're still working with students. That's terrific news. It's a fascinating movie. It's very, very rich. It's the opposite of anything minimalist because it encompasses so many different kinds of people. It's rare to see a film which both has a convincing portrait of a left-wing writer and of a stockbroker. I mean, this shows some of Antonioni's range. The scenes in the park are very rich and beautiful in the way they're staged and seem like directly ancestral to the park scenes in Blow Up. They're the two greatest and most developed park scenes in Antonioni. I very much like the strange opening architecture or the water towers or whatever they are that you see out of the writer's windows. That's supposed to be an unusual district in Rome that I'm hoping someone who's more expert on Italy than me can tell about.
Hamish, can you tell about it?
Yeah, so this is the so-called EUR district that Mussolini initially commissioned, and it was supposed to be completed for the 1942 World's Fair that was going to be hosted in Italy to celebrate the 20th anniversary of fascism, not only in Italy, of course, but in Europe. Now, obviously, that didn't happen because of the war and the overthrow of his government. And as far as I understand it, the region was certainly never completed and fell into some disrepair for some time until in the 1950s there were new moves to not complete it so much, but to rejuvenate it with a new generation of buildings in time for the Rome Olympics in 1960, I believe. So it's interesting how two kind of moments of kind of political nationalism, I guess, and pride fueled the development of this region. So what we get at the beginning of the film and at the end, and at certain key scenes throughout, is a kind of an essaying of this very strange space that's got at least two different historical periods in terms of its design, but it also is unfinished. So there's a lot of parkland and undeveloped, space in this kind of weird sort of outer suburban area. And to some extent, it's still like that today if you go there today, although, you know, there's obviously been subsequent building in that region. But, you know, one of the fascinating things about, for example, the construction site, which is such a key, you know, space in the film that the couple kind of have their awkward rendezvous next to and will feature at the end. It's very unclear when you watch the film. Is this a construction site, or is this building that was sort of half built at some point in the past and has been just sort of closed down, because it seems to not really be progressing. So that wonderful tension in Antonioni that he loves between sort of things that are in development, things that are being built, but also things that are decaying, that might be kind of breaking down, and the kind of slippery space between them.
Now, Hamish, you had... Oh, go ahead.
Train to Rome and you get off and you take a cab into Rome, you'll pass through EUR. So good way to... You can still see the buildings that Antonioni filmed, like the church and the town hall and places like that.
They're still there.
Now, Hamish, you had made the claim that you would put Red Desert in with the three other films. I think that it's actually quite a radical break, but I want to hear, because I know other people have also lumped it in as a tetralogy. So let's talk about the film first, and then how it's links to the three prior films. So if you would, Hamish.
Well, I mean, I think obviously Red Desert's in colour, and that makes it different. But I think the film, in many ways, Le Cliché and Red Desert go together in some ways more than any of the other films. I mean, I would argue, for example, that those two films share a much more important relationship than Red Desert and Blow Up. Now, it's not just because Monica Vitti stars in them, although that's very important. And like Richard has alluded to so far, I think she's actually she's a very underrated actor in many respects. Her performances in these films are absolutely remarkable and very unusual in terms of, if we look at screen performance and the traditional screen performance, she's a very unique figure. But what connects these two films in particular, I think, is really what Richard was referring to, which is that Le Cliché and Il Tesoro Rosa are the only two Antonioni films I've found that when you show them to students, they will be absolutely astonished. The other films will be of interest, and you know, some people will like them. These two films, though, push his style so far that not only did he never go anywhere near that again, but nobody else did either. So the interest in abstraction in both of these films is obviously enormous. The interest in the surface of the image itself. So the first few minutes of Le Cliché are as radical as anything in Red Desert, the way he introduces these bodies in this ground floor apartment in the EUR district. And of course, the end of Le Cliché, you know, it's completely dehumanized. Well, I should correct that. There are humans there, of course, but our protagonists are gone. The notion of the camera showing up and the characters not showing up, and yet the film continuing for 7 minutes, and really, in fact, showing us a space that we're used to from previously in the film as a background, but now becomes, you know, the entire, you know, it floods the image quite literally. This is where both of these films, I think, are almost science fiction films. So later on in his career, in the 1980s, he wanted to mount a science fiction film, and of course, no one would ever fund it. But some smart aleck critic responded, all of your films are science fiction films. And I think certainly Le Cliché and Il Tesoro Rosa in many ways express that radical surface in terms of, you know, use of the image, but also the fact that he doesn't actually show us anything that is itself inherently strange. What he does is he shows us that the everyday surface of objects and spaces and of course architecture in Rome and Ravenna, respectively, in those two films, is, when filmed a certain way, unbelievably not only futuristic, but even with the older architecture, unbelievably kind of confronting and mysterious.
Mike Ross, would you agree that those four films go together, or do you see a break between Le Cliché and Red Desert?
Obviously, it's a little bit different, but I think they go together. I think people are making a good case that they're a unified body of four movies. The finale of Le Cliché is very strange. perhaps I'm projecting because I lived through the era, but there are headlines dealing with the danger of nuclear war in the newspaper that get shown near the ending of the film. And I've often had the feeling that the sense of depopulation had something to do with terrible anxieties over nuclear war and the nuclear bomb. And I'd be interested, do other people feel that that's a possibility, or am I simply reading in a personal feeling here?
No, I think certainly both of these films, particularly Le Clissé, can be seen as, sort of, well, in many different ways. But one thing they do is they express a certain kind of apocalyptic, anxiety, certainly. Much has been made that, Le Clissé came out, roughly at the same time, or was made roughly at the same time as the Cuban Missile Crisis and this sort of thing. It's incredibly important, his interest in this moment. And of course, when we talk about the American films, there's another whole story there in terms of his response to a very quickly changing historical situation vis-a-vis the Cold War. But no, I think that can't be overstated. The other thing, of course, that is of growing interest to scholars is the way in which Ilda Soto-Rosso, and of course going back to some of his documentaries too, is interested in the effect of technology on the environment. And some people are really now writing, serious journal articles and chapters, for example, arguing that Red Desert is the first ever climate change film. Now, I think that's a little bit dangerous in the sense that it oversimplifies the film, and famously Antonioni refused to sort of condemn technology and in fact said that, for him the factory is a much more interesting space to film than a row of trees. But nonetheless, the actual cost of modernity in so many different ways, socially, personally, but also materially and environmentally, is palpable throughout these films.
Richard?
Climate change might be a bit much, but I mean, there is really, I think, a constant allusion to when we see the smokestacks belching out their sort of reddish, smoke and whatever, that being linked directly to the reddish mane of Monica Vitti. She's another form of industrial waste, terrible. She's also been a product of that. In a way, going back to the tetralogy, one can almost divide it in the middle, in that I think, Le Clissé and Red Desert are both films in which they're unimaginable, to my mind, I don't know if others feel the same way, without Monica Vitti, the same way that the Joseph von Sternberg films are unimaginable without Marlene Dietrich, that it's just one of those very happy occasions in the history of cinema where an artist and an actor came together and just were so in sync and worked so perfectly together that it really becomes inseparable from the aesthetic of the film. And I think Antonioni only discovered that. I think when he worked with her in La Ventura, he was getting to know her. Again, she has a secondary role in La Notte, but by the time he comes to make Eclipse and Red Desert, she's not only romantically involved with him, but I mean, in a sense, there's a kind of amazing symbiosis between the two. And again, it makes it, I don't want to say unique. We can think of a couple of there's Godard and Karina, there's, a number of other directors we can think of who have these kind of really extraordinarily close relationships with their sort of lead actresses generally, and the films become unthinkable without them. Let me say just one more thing about the way that Antonioni works in response to what Mike was saying about the newspapers. I think Antonioni believes a lot in what you might call resonances. Take, for example, the stock market scene in Eclipse. It takes place in the stock market. Obviously, it's full of a lot of energy and kind of emotion and all that. It also takes place in a spot in Rome. The Rome stock market has moved since then. That was built by the Romans for sacrifices. This is where they would bring animals and other kinds of creatures to sacrifice if they wanted some favor from the gods. And I think Antonioni truly believes that the resonance of that kind of comes out in the film, or comes out of the stock market. So his choice of places is amazingly precise. One of the reasons I think scholars love him so much, because there's so much to learn and to study, that it's just not that place, but it's that place and its history that he's filming.
And by filming the stock market on this very privileged historical site, of course, he's also treating this relatively newfound obsession with the stock market and with a certain version of capitalism that we see in the film. He's treating it in this slightly ironic way. You know, he's really presenting it as a kind of new religion, and particularly through the characterization of Vittoria's mother, which is really quite a sharp, you know, critique of a pre-war generation who, of course, you know, have to, in a sense, forget what happened during the war and during the fascist period, and they're hanging their hat now completely on this much more kind of American version of a market economy, and it's at the expense, obviously, of so much, as the film makes clear. Just finally, too, on Monica Vitti, I think Richard's exactly right. When he stops using her in Blow Up, it's not a coincidence that his style radically is transformed, because particularly in Le Cliché and Red Desert, the entire film, I would argue, at least many sequences, is structured around her, so that the ambiguity of the camera's position or interest vis-a-vis whether it cares about the human drama, whether it's interested in the psychology of the characters, or whether it's actually much colder and more interested in, you know, kind of graphic and spatial and architectural interests. That tension, which is really important in the four films, really disappears very much, I think, with the English language films. And I don't think it's a coincidence at all that's you know, that Monica Vitti sort of leaves at that juncture.
Well, let me end this segment here. But before I do, I want to give my interpretation of Red Desert and why I think it's a radical break. I think the three Le films are very. They have their characters are all inward. They're all looking inward. We don't really get into them. We don't get into the characters in L'Avventura. We don't get into the marriage. Really, there's something hidden away from the viewer. We don't know what is at the root cause of that problem. And certainly, Leclise is the most hermetic of those films. When we get to Red Desert, I mean, yeah, there's the obvious color change, but to me, we get such not only is it like the color being vomited out, but the emotional tenor of that film is so different because we get so deeply emotionally into the Monica Vitti character. For example, there's the great and wonderful beach story that she tells her son when he's faking a illness. And not only do we get that, which is a radical color change from the rest of the film, but she's telling it and we are seeing inside her mind. There's the scene on the river when there's 6 or 7 people that are cooped up in a shack. They destroy the shack literally, physically, and then exit it. And to me, that's such a and then we get the Richard Harris character, and he's always looking outward. He's going to Argentina or Chile with his company, and so the first 3 films there are so inward directed in many ways, and then we get this radical shift outward in terms of color. And then when we get so there we have the sort of emotional outwardness that sort of explodes in that film. We get to Blow Up, and we have that intellectual. We go from the emotion to the intellect. There's that great, what a lot of people have called the pure cinema scene, where the main character, I forget the actor's name, what? Yeah, where he's looking at he's trying to piece together the mystery, and you know, boom, 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 and we're there with him, and we're looking out almost from behind his eyes. So where again we're intellectually we're probing outward, and then when we get to Zabriskie Point, that's the most that's the physicality outward. We've gone from the sort of industrial stuff to here we're in the American Southwest, and we have all of these sweeping color landscapes, and we have these 2 characters that are basically ciphers, and we're just looking outward. So to me, those 3 films, I would consider. I don't really consider them a trilogy, but I think there's a better argument to be made that we've gone from the inward trilogy to the outward trilogy, emotionally, intellectually, and then physically. So that if anyone, if that does any of that make any sense to you guys? Or
I guess the one thing I would say about the connection between Red Desert and the English language films is that in Red Desert, very radically, Antonioni starts to use the zoom lens. Previously, he used it very sparingly. I mean, if at all. So, you know, when the camera appeared to move, it was literally moving. So, tracking shots, panning shots were much more the norm. And so, there's a kind of what now looks like a very classic post-war modernist, deep focus kind of aesthetic, which is brought to a real peak with the work that Gianni Di Vincenzo in particular does with La Notte and L'Eclisse, and in La Ventura as well, although that's not Di Vincenzo. With Red Desert, and then certainly with the English language films, he starts to use the zoom lens. And the zoom lens, in a very explicit way, the zoom lens will become arguably the most important tool for what we now call the new Hollywood. And I don't mean the sort of the Jaws version, I mean the early 70s version, most famously, of course, enunciated in the work of Robert Altman. And so, this important dovetailing, I think, between Antonioni and Blow Up, as we'll talk about in a minute, I'm sure, is an absolutely crucial film that inspired that generation of American filmmakers that rose to fame in the 1970s. So I think on that level, there's certainly an important connection. But I guess on the other stuff that you're saying there, Dan, to me, it is quite different. I mean, I agree with you that Monica Vitti's character, Juliana, in Red Desert is painfully apparent to us. I mean, she's like an inside-out kind of, she's the only character that Antonioni, I think, acknowledged was neurotic. He refuted very much that Monica Vitti was in L'Eclisse, and I agree with him. With the English language films, for me at least, I agree with Sam Rody that the characters are of very little interest, actually, to the film. There's very little overt subjectivity in the way that the camera treats David Hemmings in Blow Up, for example. But that would be my view.
Yeah, I would say that he's, in the English language films, very distant from the characters. I mean, he's really an outsider, and he kind of plays his outsiderness in terms of the way that he structures shots, the way that he films his characters. Just one correction, though, if I may, Hamish, I really do think the zoom that you see in that new American cinema really comes from television, because
I know, it does, I agree.
Like that. I think they all came from TV, where that was already the sort of standard sort of technical language.
Yeah. Oh, no, sorry, I didn't mean to suggest it just came from Antonioni. It definitely comes from television for people like Altman, although that generation admired Antonioni immensely, obviously.
Mike Gross, do you have a final comment before we move on to the other films in the next segment?
Just very briefly, the zoom lens started actually in the 1920s, and you can see it in some old films, but it needed such intense bright sunlight, you could only use it outdoors on brilliant days, and you already start seeing it on American TV, like in Joseph H. Lewis's work in his TV westerns. Every so often there'll be a zoom lens show up, and it really it looks so ugly and otherwise brilliant work that Lewis was doing with camera movement in that era. Just a thought here. On the story that Monica Vitti tells, it's like in Red Desert. It's full of rocks and ocean. In some ways, it's like a version or a reference to La Ventura and the scenes in the rocks and the ocean at the start of that film.
Yeah, you get almost the rocks as the human form.
Yes. The narrator says they're like flesh, and they're like biomorphic abstraction, where you see in artists like Max Ernst or Arshel Gorky or other artists of the surrealistic tradition, where the abstract forms would also be like the forms of animals or people.
Yeah, I know. You look a recent film, Winter Sleep, by Nuri Bilge Ceylan. You can see that in some of the Turkish landscapes and the homes built into the rocks too. It's very reminiscent of that as well.
He has such a good visual style. He's very distant. It was the only film of his I've been able to see on the big screen. It looks so gorgeous there.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's end this segment. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to make a correction. I mean, zoom lenses were around since the 20s. Their problem was not sunlight. They didn't need any more sunlight than any other lens. Their problem was that they didn't zoom very much. They zoomed about 3 to 1. So they weren't really that useful. You see them sometimes. Probably the most extended use of them is Leni Riefenstahl in the Olympia film. They only began to be used in the 50s when the French company Ingenieux came out with their zoom lens, which did 8 to 1 and then 10 to 1. And then they got much more. There wasn't really a problem with sunlight. It's a problem. The zooms themselves weren't really that useful for filmmakers.
It's interesting too when Wim Wenders was working with Antonioni for Beyond the Clouds, and Antonioni kept using the zoom lens, and Wenders apparently was horrified, and he says, what are you doing? This is incredibly unsophisticated of you. And it's like, Vim, have you seen any of Antonioni's films after Le Clisse?
Yeah. All right. Well, let's end this segment. We'll come back and continue in a moment.